Everyone would please be seated and turn your phones to off or silent mode. Would the secretary please call the roll?
Yes, ma'am. Patty Gundy?
Here.
Jim Carvin?
Here.
Dave Crawford?
Here.
And we have a quorum. We will forego the minutes from last month's meeting, and we'll start with the first agenda item, and that is a request for A1A open house signage. And who is representing that issue?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Before we jump into it, I just wanted to give a quick context because there's a procedural aspect to this that I want to clarify for the board. So what you have in your packet and has been submitted is a request for a variance from town ordinance related to signage. Mm-hmm. And the request specifically asks for a variance for open house signs on A1A. And I wanted to mention to you, and thank you, I received an email from you, Ms. Gundy, yesterday related to some state statutes that apply to state highways and advertising along those. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But upon further review and research on this specific issue, I believe procedurally it would be really inappropriate and without jurisdiction of this board and even the town to entertain even a variance for this, and here's why. When you look on this application, and this is the uniform application not only for anybody but also embodying our town ordinance, you will see in here that the property owner is somebody who would have to apply for the variance. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly A1A is a state highway. The town doesn't own it, doesn't have any ownership ability of it. And why is this important? Well, a traditional variance that comes in, for example, for a fence moving or something like that we've seen many times, the property owner or its agent would come in on behalf of that property owner to do something to their property. And we apply the town code to that and evaluate whether the variance would be appropriate. You can imagine why that's important, because somebody could come in, if that weren't the case, and apply for a variance on your property, or your property's property, or your property date. The idea is that that flies in the face of a variance, the property owner. So again, it's procedurally inappropriate from a legal perspective to allow somebody to apply for a variance without the authority of the property, in this case, the state of Florida. So I just want to be clear. Now, what is underlying this is that we have an ordinance in the town that talks about signs. And I think really this is a question about changing that, really. And as this board is aware, we've been going through a review of the Land Development Code. We're in process. We have an upcoming workshop. I'll defer to Jim on the date, but I believe it's November 14th.
It's immediately after the November planning zoning hearing.
So we'll have a planning and zoning meeting on the 14th, and then we'll have an open house workshop.
Scott, you're paying attention to this part of it.
And again, I apologize, I know I'm directing, but this is for the benefit of everybody. So we'll be having a workshop, and among the several things that we'll be talking about will be the current version of the sign ordinance and all of the language there. We aren't taking any position. We are simply soliciting input, not only from the community, but obviously also from the planning board. And once we receive that, it will be packaged, summarized, and memorialized to the town council. But again, so as not to put ourselves in a position that would be probably legally indefensible, I don't believe it's appropriate to move forward with a variance request for signs on A1A. I don't know how that's defensible. I did follow up with the state of Florida, and there's an individual from FDOT. And so he was thankfully able to give me some information, and one of the things is the state highway system is unique in Florida, and it's very clear that it includes such things as the Turnpike, or I-95, or many of the I-highways in Florida, 275, 295, I-10. But A1A is also a highway, and it's designated as a scenic highway in the state of Florida. So there are other aspects that play into how things can unfold on the scenic highway that is A1A. So I'll be able to get more information on that procedurally and otherwise, but again, there are really two things. The first is the variance through this microscope, and then really the bigger issue of signage within the town. So again, I'm sorry bringing this to you now, but it's difficult to sort of convey all this without all of us being here.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And Scott, why don't you, if you would like to come up to the microphone just so we can address you. Full disclosure, Scott's a neighbor of mine, he lives in Pebble Bay, and was on the board of our homeowners association years ago.
Yes, ma'am.
So basically what we were, and I, as chairman, I also agree that it isn't something that we can have a variance for. We ran into the same exact situation a couple of months ago with another type of request, and so for the reasons that Pete just described, this is not the proper forum, but it is good for you to hear that there is going to be this workshop on rewriting the ordinances and the land development code, so that you, representing the real estate agents, can be aware that there will be this discussion. And so if you would like to plan to go to that, or
Is that the October or November?
it's
November 14th.
November 14th.
It'll be immediately following the planning and zoning meeting that we have on that date.
Okay.
But it'll just depend on the agenda, whether it's, 9:45,
That's right.
10:15, but it'll be
Okay.
immediately following this meeting.
Okay.
And it's just at that point, if I understand it correctly, we're just going to come up with, these are the things we think we should be looking at. It's not going to be we're rewriting it that day. We're just kind of coming up with a list in conjunction with people that will be invited to attend. I guess we'll send out some kind of public notice or post a notice on our website, on the town's website, saying that this workshop will be held. And you could certainly mention the issue or prepare something if you want to. And I think I can speak for the whole board. We've read your letter and we understand the issues that you're running into. I have a couple of questions that it's still okay, even though we're not talking about this particular issue today, because we can't, but I had a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
And that was that when you have an open house, basically, if it's a gated community, people can't get in with some sort of a pass code anyway. Were you envisioning that open house signs would be put in front of gated communities, or just the areas of the town that were not gated?
Well, it could be any of them. It could be Pebble Bay. It could be Mar Bristol. One of our agents, I've been a realtor for about 2 or 3 years. I've been part-time before that. My wife has been a realtor for 25 years. We've lived in Pebble Bay for 26 years. So I've been a long-time resident. So we had a situation where one of our agents was doing an open house on one of the streets in Indian River Shores and had a sign out at the intersection of the street and A1A. One of our public service officers came by, picked up her sign, went and saw her at the open house and said, the next time it's a $500 fine. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next day, and that was a Saturday, so the next day was a Sunday, we had another open house scheduled in Mar Bristol. I told the property owner that we can't put a sign out on A1A because of the ordinance, and we don't want to get a $500 fine. They were not too happy with us. They were really unhappy when they came home in the development next to them. Another real estate agent had a sign out, open house, big, huge open house, big sandwich board open house sign at the same time. So one, it puts our public service officers in a spot to where do they get one? Do they cherry pick? Do they get everyone? And you got different times, so it's hard on them and it's hard on us. And at the same time, I'm a resident, and when it comes time to sell my house, I want my agent or my wife or whoever to be the best, have all the best ability to sell the house, and that includes having an open house on a Sunday. So at the same time, as a resident, I don't want it to be like Vero, where you go down on the corner and you got the everything that's out at the Indian River Fairgrounds and the Fireman's, fair, and some guy that wants to pressure wash your house. I don't want to see all those signs. We've got a beautiful street here, but all I'm saying is possibly from 12 to 4 on Sunday, realtors would be able to have their open house sign out front. If you read the code, it's a little unclear, but a lot of developments, there's another development in Indian River Shores that actually they didn't want my sign out there, they didn't want Remax's sign out there, so they had their own sign made specific to their development, open house for that development. It's very tastefully done, it sits out on the road, and it's been like that for years. And then at the same time, they also make you use the generic open house sign in front of the property as well. So you have a sign on the road, and then you have a sign, in front of their gate, and then you have a sign in front of the house. That's their sign. So that's the dilemma that we have. And where our agent got cited, that same day, another agent came like half an hour later and started the open house a half hour later. Her sign was out there and she never got anything. And then the next day, her sign was out there again. So, and at the same time, there's realtors in Vero that put signs out on Saturday. They'll do an open house on Saturday and Sunday, and they leave it out overnight on the weekend. With their advertising, I got a problem with that too. I don't want any of that. I don't want any signs on A1A other than from 12 to 4 on a Sunday. So, and specifically to open house. So that's the dilemma I think that we all have as realtors and as residents trying to sell our homes.
Well, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and we'll see you on the
And
board.
you're on the mailing list for the town, right?
Yes.
You get all of the emails that the town sends out, so there'll be something, I'm assuming will be posted there?
Okay.
Okay,
Well, thank you for listening to me.
okay, thank you.
So at this point, Madam Chair, I would recommend that we table and take no further action just formally for this application.
So what?
It would just be just so it's clear on the record that.
Yes, but why would we table it? Why wouldn't we just say that it is not something?
Well, because, I guess you could do any version of a motion. I just want to take a final action. So it could be,
Okay.
a motion to reject based on, lack of jurisdiction, whatever the appropriate motion would be.
Okay, so can I have a motion from someone?
I move to table the application for lack of jurisdiction and I don't even consider it a variance, lack of authority for this board to consider.
Thank you.
I second.
Second, all in favor, aye? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a question.
It's up to you, Mr. Chair, if you want me to answer it.
You can ask me, and then I'll
Okay.
ask the attorney.
If it's a state highway, then does Indian River Shores have can they restrict the sign right now anyway?
That's what it sounded like when I spent a lot of time, I don't know whether you've gone on the state governance documents, but there were pages of the types of signs and the size of signs and how you have to apply for a sign. You can only have it in one particular spot. You cannot move it from another one. So that was all state regulated for any state highway, which A1A is considered one of those. So, and as Pete said, he's going to try to get more.
Yes, ma'am.
More details that will narrow it down, but you should go in and look at it yourself, because a lot of this was state regulated, and you would have to pay a fee and re-up the fee at the beginning of every year by January 15th, and if you don't pay the fee again, then there's a $300 fine. I mean, it went on and on and on about the kind of signs, and that's when I sent an email to our town manager and our town attorney saying, is this so?
That's exactly right, Madam Chair. That's exactly right. And the information is through the Department of Transportation. And if you just did a simple Google search of Department of Transportation billboard regulation, that's sort of the biggest area along the interior highways in the state of Florida. As you travel north and south, you see, billboards. And so that's the genesis of a lot of it. But yes, you're correct. It's very, very in-depth.
It was very confusing to try to narrow it down to just your issue or similar issues and like that. So,
Okay.
Anyway, okay.
Can I, when you were talking to the state,
Yes, sir.
dot guy,
Yes, sir.
You know, my community owns to the middle of the road.
Yeah, and there's,
And it's not A1A.
Right.
It's another road. And, you know, the road's there, and it was taken a long time ago, and, you know, it's eminent domain as far as everybody's concerned, but technically, we own to the middle, because when somebody wants to put utilities underneath there, they ask. Just check to make sure that, you know, the A1A communities don't own to the middle of the road and the state has taken that. And that they absolutely own that, because, you know, it's not A1A that I'm talking about, but
I understand exactly what
I
you're
doubt if
saying.
the state paid anybody and they just say, hey, here it is.
And that goes back to, you know, there's really two issues here. There's the state-owned property,
Right.
and then there's private property that's right up next to it. But importantly, even on the private property, whether it's a road that's really belongs to somebody, or your yard, or a setback area,
Yeah.
the key is that we still have an ordinance that applies to that.
Yes.
But that is a very valid point. But I can tell you, in my years of experience, and I'm sure Jim in our Public Works Department can also tell you, that even things as simple as a driveway connection to A1A is much more significant than trying to do one in a neighborhood, you know, that we have full jurisdiction over. So I totally agree with you, knowing exactly what it is, but we should at least start with the premise that they own most of it.
Yes.
But I mean, just check on it.
Absolutely.
Because it's kind of one of these things, well, you know,
Again,
I.
we want to do the right thing.
Yeah, the state probably never paid anybody, so, you know, they just took away everything from me. But anyway, it's just a side note.
Thank you very much.
We'd like to move on to agenda item number 2, 800 Manatee Inlet, tree of special concern. And would you like to come to the podium?
Morning, Board.
Hello.
Do you have the packet?
We did, yes.
Okay.
We've all received all the details.
So I represent the Hill Group. I'm the project manager on an exterior renovation there. And there's 3 magnolias on the property. 2 right in front on Manatee Inlet, and then 1 in the south side, about halfway back on the property. And that is the one that's in question.
Can you say your name for the record?
Oh, Steve Burris.
Thank you.
And so the architect has drawn a hardscape plan with a generator, full house generator corral, and a lot of this is in very close proximity to the root structure of the tree. And there was an old propane tank that was not usable anymore. It was deemed unacceptable to keep going, so we had to remove that, and a lot of the root system was around that tank and had to be cut away. The tree already looks very ill, in my opinion, compared to the others on the street. So I'm asking the board for permission to remove the tree. I have a letter from Jimmy's Tree Service, which is in the packet, claiming very much the same that I've expressed here. There are trees going back in with the landscape plan, 5 palm trees.
Saw that.
Yep, so, any questions?
Any questions? And Gary? You?
I see no objection to this. If the tree was a tree of special concern, again, because it was a multi-trunk tree, if you looked at it, it actually forked off near the ground and came up. And when they do that, you combine the diameter of those trunks together to get that. In this particular case, I even spoke to a certified arborist, I believe it's Jimmy's Tree Service, looked at this case and suggested you might want to look at it because the propane tank had been taken kind of out from under the roots on this tree to see if he could declare it hazardous, which he couldn't. There's a little dead branch in the top, but see, that could be trimmed off, reduce it. And when you rate a tree hazardous, you actually have to rate the condition of the tree itself, not the fact that the tree raises a sidewalk or raises your pool pavers. That doesn't make a tree hazardous. That's just a nuisance condition it creates. Here they took the propane tank out, which undermines the tree and so forth. That was an introduced tree many years ago. So that's a native tree. Applicant certainly has shown concern to replant significant landscape. So it just impedes in the hardscape area, and I would recommend its approval. And I see no further need for mitigation on this particular site.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board or from anyone else? Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve as
Just and I know it's not on the, for the record, Jim Harper, Town Manager. Excuse me, I know it's not on the agenda, but I just did want to give just a very brief comment on the Land Development Code Update Phase 2, since we've been chatting about it. So we've been working on Phase 2, which is the second piece. Much of that is really more of a process of identification of topic areas. The Phase 1 was really a critical foundation because it dealt with consistency and compliance, both internal and external, and we did address an awful lot of things there. This second piece is a little more nuanced in a way, because there are things that we have in our code which, as they stand, are perfectly acceptable, both legally and from a policy standpoint in terms of where the council is and where the board may be. But that doesn't mean that there might not be public input on it or consideration for for certain things. So the idea for the workshop is just for convenience standpoint, the planning, zoning, and variance meeting would conclude. We have our consultants that we're working with that will come down from Tallahassee, and they will essentially do a very, very brief, high-level overview of what we did in Phase 1. Not very detailed at all, just really almost to the extent of what I said, that we addressed certain things and so on. And then a lot of it will really be to solicit input from anybody that's here in terms of ordinances or topics that either they want to address that are currently in code, that they want to check or not in code, and that they want to include. And then at that point in time, there'll be what I'll just sort of say is the second phase of work in this, which is where our team internally and our consultants will take the feedback that we receive from the open house and any that we may receive, electronically or otherwise, and then we'll begin to put together an outline and a presentation for town council. Now, with the workshop happening in November, our goal would really be, and understanding obviously we don't stop work in November, December, but we know that it's a little tighter in terms of deliverables. We'll just put it that way in that period of time. We would hope to have a presentation to council on the recommendations. Hopefully, I think January might be a little premature from November, but certainly February, the latest March. The important piece about Phase 2 is that a lot of this is going to be discretionary. Again, is there a movement to change something that exists, as it does now, or not, on a variety of different things. So that's just sort of where we are with Phase 2, and just, Phase 2 for clarity, as I said, we'll do it after the PZV meeting, so it won't be a PZV function. Technically, it'll be a staff function to, take whatever input and, document it and do all that kind of stuff, and then go back internally and do our work and put together what we have.
And so, from a preparation standpoint, I'm pretty familiar with the land development code, but it's huge, and much of it relates to property, but there are also all kinds of sections that talk about the way we handle finances and the way we handle. There's more than just property-related information in the land development code, and we had a subset that we as planning, zoning, and variance refer to, but there's much more out there if you look at the entire thing. If you go online and you click on the heading and start looking at it, there's lots more. Are you looking at a subset here, or are you looking at the entire land development code and looking for feedback on everything?
Well, for clarity, I think it's important to narrow down what we mean by the land development code. So the land development code are only those things that are covered under what is titled the land development code.
Even though when we go into it on the website, it brings us in and shows us much more.
Well, again, that's just format. So, for example, the land development code, let's just say it starts at chapter 150. Mm-hmm. The extent to which I'm looking at any items in the Code of Ordinances that are not contained within the Land Development Code, I'm not,
at this stage unless they affect the land development code. There are some things that are housed outside the land development code. So I think about it this way from a semantic standpoint. The code of ordinances encompass all ordinances that the town council has passed. That's everything from, the chapter 1 to, the end. Within that is, and I think on the Muni Code it's broken out this way, the land development code. So that's what we looked at phase 1. We did look at things technically outside the land development code, but only to the extent that they touched on something we were going to change in the land development code for consistency purposes. So once the land development code review is completed and the relevant ordinances are passed, if any, and honestly, let's be candid, for all I know, the council may not want to change anything else. I don't know. That'll be up to them and that'll be up to input. But then after that, outside of all those consistency and concurrency pieces that we looked at in phase 1 and phase 2, that will make a determination as to other things in the code. And we've been doing that on an ad hoc basis. And a lot of times it's not so much that we can't read it and see that it needs a change, but a lot of it is timing, is we know that this process is going on. For example, there's an ordinance that's going to be up on the October 26th agenda to address water in Chapter 52. That's not necessarily part of the land development code, though you can make an argument there's a connection because we're talking about water restrictions and water and things like that. So as we come across things, we will deal with them ad hoc, but I think that's what will happen after the phase 2 is complete, is that we'll take a look at some things that weren't really part of anything that we did, and if they come up, they do. If they don't, then they don't. Because I don't want to change things just for change sake. But there are some issues with a number of the ordinances just simply because of the fact that they need to be looked at. And
I'm also reading more and more and more that the state is now coming out with regulations. He points that out all the time, where all of a sudden the state has said this is the way it has to be. Like the trees, for example, where trees have a different interpretation if you're a property owner now than they did several years ago when we wrote our ordinances. So when it comes to those sort of things, is the consultant that you're working with, or are you looking to us to say this no longer applies?
We're doing that. And a perfect example is mangroves. We've repealed the mangrove ordinance.
Yes.
It had sat there, for a while since the state law, had been changed. And that's a perfect example of that one-off piece that was important to do outside of this entire thing. But I do think that, again, with the phase 2 concept, I think we're at a point where there's nothing that we have to change for statutory compliance or for internal consistency within our own code. It's just a good update, because many of those things, I'm not sure what was happening in 2016, but there was a flurry of ordinance activity in 2016, and we actually have had to address, a number of those. For example, the water ordinance that we're addressing in Chapter 52, that was passed in 1981 and had not been addressed since. So you have, and for example, in that regard, St. John's Water Management District has watering, restrictions, and we had our own since 1981. But I just use that as an example, and that's just simply to say that it is an ongoing thing. It's something that, even though we're doing it conceptually in phase 1 and phase 2, after phase 2 is done, it'll just be something that we continually look at in areas outside of the narrow land development code that we haven't already addressed.
Okay, thank you.
Jim, are we going to get some, or will there be something distributed in advance of this public hearing as to what's on the agenda and what a rough outline of the discussion topics will be?
Yes, hopefully within, let's see, today, I think today's is the 10th. I would imagine that within about 2 weeks, certainly no later than 2 weeks before the meeting, we'll have we'll have an agenda out. It may not be narrow in terms of items to consider, ordinance number, 1, 2, 3, or 6, 7, 8. It may not be that narrow, but it'll be a guideline for the discussion to include input.
Will they be in sort of draft proposal circulated, or is it too early?
No, and the reason is this, and this is where phase 2 comes to a little more nuance. It's unclear what direction the town council may or may not want to take on any topics that either come up at the open house or on topics that have not come up that they or this board.
So this is really a policy meeting.
Yeah, it's a very general. Yeah, very general. We're getting input, and then we'll come talk to the board about it, and then we'll talk to the council about it. Because what I don't want to do is begin to draft ordinances for review just to have them not consent. Ironically, the draft, that's the easy part. It's figuring out what we have left that we can consider, and of those things that we can consider, are there things that we even should or should not look at? And then of those things that we should look at, what should we change? What do we need to change? And I do actually look a little more focused towards needs as opposed to wants. My experience in this area, whether it was at the sheriff's office or elsewhere, and looking at ordinances or policies, those wants sometimes that have, you could name them an incident, right? They're just because of one thing. It can be real challenging because it seems like a great idea at the time, and I will confess that I have written policies that I just thought were brilliant pieces of work, and then 6 months later I went to apply the policy I wrote, and I asked myself, who's the idiot that wrote this? And then my assistant Lucy, who was working for me at the time, said, well, sir, you wrote it. So that's a real challenge, the change just for change's sake. I'm definitely not for that, but looking at things that, and Liz can tell you, we've seen a lot of things, even as basic as the variance application. When it comes up, we should address it, and a lot of times we just don't see it in application, and then it comes up and we have to apply the ordinance, and we're left, kind of shrugging our shoulders because we really don't have that clear guidance. But I'm hoping that we'll get enough input in phase 2, both, from the board, from the council, because everyone will be invited, the board, the council. It'll be a public open house meeting, and we'll just take all the information we get from there and figure out where it is.
Great. Any other questions from anyone? Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, board.
Everybody.
Thank you, board. Yeah, that's an interesting point that you mentioned. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know.
To listen, he doesn't want to give feedback. He's not expecting us to do anything for him, what he just said. He just wants us to, if we want to, we can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. Because it's not part of our function.